One inherent problem, I think, to constitutional AI in particular is, and that's what sets it apart, I think, from human constitution, is the vagueness or lack of clarity on what particular terms mean. So this is something I struggle with.
But the amazing thing about this is that it works at all. Like, it's like, what? This actually works.
Essentially, Tucker Carlson keeps pushing Sam Altman. Who is it that decides what is right or wrong at OpenAI, right? And Altman kept dodging the question. In the end, he said, you know what, there's a group of people, and I am the head of those people. We decide based on our like Western liberal, whatever kind of values, that the particular response that the model gives is okay, and then not. Some of them are not, right?
So I think Carlson's kind of wrong.
Yeah.
But it's also important, right? If you do things like get a properly representative sample of folks, and actually even then, right, if you get a proper so you need like 17 of people from this category of people and 5 people, that's probably not right either. So we know that what is moral is not homogeneous, but what the model would produce, because it's averaging, would be homogeneous.
Yeah, I think that's also useful though, like in a world where we can't agree on pretty much anything, not even at a very local scale, but now at a global scale, then I think it's a pretty useful measure of what humanity thinks.
After that tangent, coming back to the idea about, what was the idea? Where were we going with that?
This is a good bloopers, huh?
Yeah.
I lost track. Just give me 1 sec.
Shoot.
Yeah, hold on a second. No, I know. So I was asking.
Okay, so picking up, right, and then maybe none of that was usable, but let's see here.
In this episode, my guest is Dr. Gillman Payette. He's currently assistant teaching professor at the University of Calgary, having held postdocs and teaching positions from various Canadian universities such as the University of Dalhousie, UBC, and the University of Lethbridge. His research has focused on logic, its philosophy, and applications in philosophical problems about ethics, action, and epistemology. Gillman has also been a very supportive friend of mine since I started my PhD at the University of Calgary, where he at the time taught logic and other courses. In this episode, we talk about the notion of constitution in humans and in AI. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome to the show, Gillman.
Thank you.
So I want to start by asking you about the notion of constitution in general. Why is it that we attend to constitutions in the first place as humans? And what are the consequences of that for doing that for AI?
So I think the reason why humans create constitutions goes back to theorists as early as Epicurus and really as early as Plato, but also we see one of its most poignant rationales in the work of Thomas Hobbes, right? Hobbes is lives through this English Civil War that was gruesome. And so he looked at it and he said, actually, morality doesn't come from God. There is no morality without a state there to impose the fulfillment of contracts. So really, anytime that we make a promise without some higher authority in the real world to actually impose and hold us to the fulfillment of that contract, we won't do it. That was the sort of lesson that he takes out of that, the aftermath and right. the English Civil War, essentially. Because of that, he says morality doesn't exist without that. And so he sees it as you need that state power always omnipresent to act as a threat so that you actually do what you're supposed to do. And so this becomes what we call contractarianism, so that there is this social contract. And there have been various interpretations of the social contract before and after that. But the point is, what is this thing? The Constitution lays down, as it were, the things that are important in that contract. And so why do we do it? We do it for clarity about what the rules are, right? And what the kinds of promises I can make, the promises I can expect people to keep, right? So a promise to do something illegal is not really a promise, right? So but of course, what is illegal? Those things get laid down too. And so then it becomes a question of what the laws are, how we should interpret those laws. So all of those questions gain content once you say, here is the implementation of state power. And from that, then you get to actually go, okay, what are the things that are going to be enforced and protected? Yeah.
Okay, now that makes me think about the case of AI, because in this particular case, right, so the constitutional AI, as we know, is essentially integrating a set of principles, let's call it a constitution, right, into the training process, or aligning process rather, of these AI models, right? Where at some point, in order to avoid harmful behaviors, the AI is supervising its earlier responses to provoking prompts, right? Where the model would otherwise respond in toxic or unwanted behaviors anyway. So the constitutions act in that way. So in a way, it served the same function, maybe to enforce, maybe a little difference, to enforce the human principles again, but now for the AI case. So basically, we want the AI to protect our values, or not to violate, let's say, our values. And this constitution, in a way, protects that instead of from humans, but now in that case, it's just AI.
Yeah. What's interesting about the constitutional AI, when you look at the actual details of how they do it,
Yeah.
as you were saying, it adds a pre-prompt to a
Mhm.
prompt to set the context. And so that then it's going to produce or narrow down the kinds of responses that it can give.
Yeah.
But it relies on us knowing what those values are that we wanted already. So and this is something that comes out in the philosophy of law even, right? Is that you write a rule and it's, oh, this rule is supposed to be something that we can follow. But of course, it can get interpreted in various ways. And there are always going to be these kind of open cases, what some theorists have called the open texture of law. And so then it's the question of what do you draw on to do that? And it is a kind of, as it were, implicit, or what some people might call the positive morality of people, of societies, right? So it raises a question, is it the case that laws actually include morality or not, or are they independent? And so it's interesting when you look at the case of something like constitutional AI, because it's really drawing on that, right? That one, in the sort of initial training stages, you had humans making selections between prompts where they're saying, oh, or responses, I should say, they're making a choice. Is this response more in line with what I want than this other response? What they're doing when they're doing that is applying this economic theory of extracting preferences from choices. So it's like when you're given a choice between some objects, that you choose one when it's available from a collection expresses that is the thing you most prefer of those things, right? So you're extracting preferences from that. So then what you have to do is say, okay, these preferences represent a kind of whole value system, and then you can extract things like obligation from that. So there's this whole theory that's working underneath the hood of the way that they design the models and the training procedures. And I guess one of the things one hopes that is a good way of going about figuring out how to extract a moral theory from that so that you get some content to the constitution that's being laid down. But it's still, right, it still relies on whatever those initial human trainers' moral intuitions were, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you get an expression of those trainers' moral intuitions, which
Yeah.
you hope is sufficient to capture a broad enough conception of morality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's amazing. That reminds me of a lot of interesting things you said, but one of them, the last thing I wanted to mention is it reminds me of a recent interview of Sam Altman with Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you have watched that interview, but essentially Tucker Carlson keeps pushing Sam Altman. Who is it that decides what is right or wrong at OpenAI, right? So you have these models. Who at the company decides this is good, this is bad, this is moral, this is not, and so on. And Altman kept dodging the question. In the end, he said, you know what, there's a group of people, and I am the head of those people. We decide based on our like Western liberal, whatever kind of values, that the particular response that the model gives is okay, and then not. Some of them are not, right? And then Carlson was again pushing, okay, then that means that it's like a very, like these models are very tuned to a particular outlook in terms of like morality and so on of a particular demographic or part of the world, background, and so on. So that speaks to that, which one of the consequences to me seems like it's going to be pretty hard to have universally aligned models, because who decides what alignment means is going to be an issue, right? Like who, for OpenAI, that's going to be one set of perspective, and then other companies and other players, other countries, right? So like China, that the companies in China that decide to train these models, they might have different perspectives based on the political and other situations that they live in. So that really, I think, branches out to several sub-problems, but one of them is that universal alignment in terms of having one model that everyone thinks is going to be safe to our values. That kind of seems to, by definition, not achievable.
Yeah. So thinking about it in the following way, because of the way that these things are trained, right? You've there are two kind of major inputs, right? There's the initial kind of training data in order to generate responses.
Yeah.
And that's going to have all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
We'll call it stuff.
Yeah.
In it, that because it's okay, these things are the most likely next thing to come out of this. Okay, great. So then here's a kind of question, right? One of the things that you want to do when you're doing good statistics is you want a representative sample. So you take a representative sample of the population for your trainers, for these people that get to select, oh, this response fits more with morality with respect to this response in terms of given the context of what the prompt was. So even if you had a representative sample, you would still get idiosyncrasies from the group of people that are there. And also asking it any kind of hard questions where we're not even, where it's almost like the point of the question is not to get a right answer. It's more just to probe what it is that we see as relevant to judging whether an answer is right or not. So one of the things about trolley problems, right?
Yeah.
These trolley problems where you have a train going down a track and there's no time to do anything that would stop it from killing people. And so then you have to hit a switch, and people come up with all these variations. The reason why you come up with all these variations is to get at what it is that actually is making you choose one option over another.
Yeah.
So those kinds of questions are meant as more experimental instruments rather than actually being things where there is a morally right answer.
Yeah.
You extract what the relevant details are.
Yeah.
And it's meant to be like an experiment, right? You have the confounding variables, which there are infinitely many in every situation, it seems.
Yeah.
And you try to isolate particular things, and people are like, oh, okay, there's only one kind of variable that can actually be varied. So you're like, oh, that thing is what matters. So is it sheer number of lives? That's one of the things that you can test out. Is it something about the relationship between you and some of the people on the track? Those kinds of things is it a question of whether or not you're letting die versus killing? Those kinds of, or how, as it were, intimate is the action, right? When it's a kind of problem where it's like pushing somebody onto the rails versus hitting the lever, right? Those kinds of things, like what, and then we ask, why does that even matter? Should it matter? So they're thought experiments more to answer questions about what matters, and then to ask more sort of fine-grained questions about that. So you have these idiosyncrasies of any group that you actually get to do the training. Because it seems to me what Sam Altman is talking about there is actually a group that decides what projects they're going to do and that kind of level of thing. Whereas the actual morality that we're seeing, as it were, implemented in whatever these models are, is going to come from those people that are making the selection. So I don't know whether those people are part of the group that he's in or not. But of course, that sort of ethics board group that he's talking about is going to decide whether the model's ready to be put into production.
Yeah.
So, right. So ultimately, they're going to make the judgment call of, is it moral enough to interact with people?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's going to be idiosyncrasies there, but I think what gives the model its morality is going to be those folks that are involved in the training of it.
Absolutely.
So even though who gets to decide what the morality is? The trainers.
Yeah.
And they don't decide anything. They just are letting their moral intuitions. So I think Carlson's kind of wrong, but it's also important, right? If you do things like get a properly representative sample of folks, and actually even then, right, if you get a proper so you need like 17 of people from this category of people and 5 people, that's probably not right either. In a way, what you want is, if you're egalitarian about it, you want all of those voices to be on par.
Yeah.
So it's like you just need many different perspectives doing the training.
I'm sure I've seen some research about the role of evaluators. So let's call those people who decide that in the process of training the evaluators. So the demographic distribution of those people actually is a topic of contention itself, right?
Yeah.
And typically these models, again, a particular demographic of in terms of country, age range, skin color, values, and so on, it is still usually along the same lines. But also another dimension that came to my mind, and some of them might have spoken about this, I can't remember, but the third dimension is one step back. The first dimension was the trainers, so the human evaluators, right? Or rather the people at OpenAI, that ethical board group, whatever, with Sam Altman on top of it. And then the second group would be the evaluators, so people in the training process who would decide, like, kind of rank these responses and then decide which one is which. But there's a third group that I think is interesting. That is people. So you and I who use ChatGPT, you have a possibility of thumbs up or thumbs down, and that kind of reinforces the behavior accordingly, right? So if you think that's a good reply or response, you get to decide that, and you get to change the model. And that makes me and vice versa. If you think that's a bad one, that give a thumbs down, that's going to change the model in a way that, try not to give this sort of model. And this, and your point, that makes me think Carlson is wrong about this in a way, because there's, in the end, with the global usage of these models, so over 1 billion people, or maybe almost 1 billion people, I think at this point are using, maybe 800 million, I don't know, but a lot of people are using ChatGPT in particular at a global scale. And that, with this third dimension, I think that actually maybe compensates for a lot of lack of distribution or representation of different groups of people in a way. So there seems to be a balance at the end of it where there's like a global understanding of what is right or wrong. At least let's talk about like moral questions, right? Like, things about good or bad, right? Technical, useful questions, that's a different thing. But let's say the entire user base of OpenAI, 1 billion people, starts asking, as some of them are asking questions about decisions, morality, and so on, and then thumbs up and down. Let's say within a few months or years, whatever that timeline is, we're gonna have a more unified, probably globally homogeneous perspective on what is right or wrong, and the model would be trained in that way.
So you have the ethics board
Yeah.
at OpenAI.
Yeah.
They have to decide who the trainers are for the initial thing.
Yeah.
Then they decide what that production is. But then that thing goes out, but it's still a learning algorithm, so it continues to learn. So it continues to learn from the inputs of all of these folks. What's interesting is that the perspective of what is moral is not homogeneous. That's one of the sort of crucial things. And even talking about
right,
when we talk about trolley problems, what we get to see the idiosyncrasies between demographics and simply between individuals. So we know that what is moral is not homogeneous, but what the model would produce, because it's averaging, would be homogeneous. So that's weird that this is what is universally moral.
Which
no, it's some sort of average of it.
Yeah. I think that's also useful though. Like in a world where we can't agree on pretty much anything, not even at a very local scale, but now at a global scale, then I think it's a pretty useful measure of what humanity thinks. And because at the end of the day, it seems to me that the best thing for a model at a global user base, with a global user base, the best thing to do is to capture as much possible of that user base's perspective on things, right? So even though, like, philosophically speaking, it's not homogeneous, like perspectives aren't really homogeneous when you look at it strictly, the average perspective, as you call it, right, what these models would eventually end up producing, that might be a very useful, just practical way of using these models for these purposes anyway. So I think that maybe unwantedly serves a good purpose, very practically speaking, like to satisfy the user base. That's one thing. But also, just isn't that good that like we have some average perspective on what humanity probably thinks? Or what do you think?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of classic objection to Aristotle's moral theory. There's this moral theory where you have the moral tends towards this mean between two extremes. And so you have what they call, say, when you talk about courage, that is a virtue. The virtuous person chooses at the mean between these two extremes. So you have, on one hand, courageousness, and on the other hand, you have foolhardiness on one hand. And at one extreme where you're just reckless. And then on the other hand, on the other extreme, you have like cowardice. Courageousness is finding the right balance between these two in your actions. And then people object to this. So there's a kind of average amount of heroin that you should do between no heroin and heroin all the time. And people are like, it's okay. But I think it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek objection. So it's not taken completely seriously. But we get that thing, right? So when you have all of these folks presenting there is a mean between the two extremes of some death penalty. That's going to be all right. But it's what would be useful is for the model to track both what is being said. So not just a simple average, or it's never going to be a simple average, but to recognize the context in which certain acceptable responses are made. Being useful means needing more information about the user. which is always a problem, right? So it's, you know, who this person is in a sense, and then they give this response. Having that kind of that data collection would be incredibly helpful in understanding why it is perhaps that some people are more sensitive to certain characteristics about a situation, right?
Yeah.
Having that kind of information as like for moral theorists would be, I think, very helpful and fascinating. So it's like a data collection tool, but that makes it, of course, more invasive because it needs more information about who the users are, which comes with its own kind of moral issues about giving. These companies have already been, as they acknowledge by the payouts that they make in lawsuits and stuff, they've already stolen so much data and from people and all of these things to train the models. So giving them more access to our lives is a morally questionable thing, but it's super useful to get to be able to link context to the decisions.
Hey everybody, if you've been watching to this point, I want to thank you deeply, because according to YouTube, most people don't make it to this point. I also want to ask you, like a friend, support me and this podcast in any way you can by subscribing to it, sharing it with anyone who might be interested, or liking the videos if you think they add value to your life. Also, if you know people or organizations who might be interested to be on the podcast, support it, or help me grow it, please make sure to get in touch, either through the comments or just by shooting me an email to amir@virtuousmachines.com. I'll make sure to put a link to the email as well as my website in the description of the video.
That's such an interesting idea. I think Altman spoke to that idea because Tucker brought up I don't know if you've heard about the news a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago at this point, where a young person talking to ChatGPT asking about like help for mental health or something like that ended up committing suicide, encouraged by the model. Don't quote me on this, but something along those lines. And then Carlson was pushing about this, and then Altman was basically, in the end, he was like, maybe one way to avoid these sort of situations is to somehow contextualize the answers. For him, it was more like the jurisdictions, partly the jurisdictions laws, right? So like committing suicide, if someone is in incredible amount of pain and there's no way to get rid of that. So some countries have regulations to accommodate that sort of suicide, but also elements of the personal background of that person. Does he or she have mental health issues? Where are they from? So, and some of that, just to the point, speaking to the point you mentioned in terms of the data collection, thing is that a lot of these models already know, not the models, but as a user, you already have a lot of your data, the information about you revealed. And also through the conversations that you have, these models have memories and they know who you are more or less. So that kind of already, so there's already an existing context about you that keeps updating, right? And not just these models, by the way, just that's like over Facebook or anything AI based, really. Like they know, someone was telling me, these models or these companies know you better than you know yourself. Like they know when you'll be hungry, when you'll be passing by a particular thrift store, that then you'll get like a pop-up on your phone suggesting, hey, do you want to buy your outfit? But so that data is already available through the conversations, through the registrations, and so on. And I think integrating that into the responses, more personalized responses coming out of these models, that would be helpful. But again, with the caveat that there's going to be some restrictions anyway. So let's say an ISIS member, the terrorist group, so if they use ChatGPT to ask moral questions, of course there's going to be limits on how accommodating that model could or should be, right? Actually, right? Because you don't want to encourage decapitating people based on your background or whatever, like that your belief system is that allows for that. So I think there's going to be some restriction, but overall, for not so extreme cases, I think that's such a great perspective. And again, in line with what Altman was saying would potentially happen in the future, or these like more contextualized, more customized responses based on your background, the jurisdiction you live in, and so on.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, that's the balance, right? It's to make it safer, we need to know more about you, and you need to have to be
Yeah.
complicit in that. And it's that sort of thing that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, right? Like it's or some people are uncomfortable with it. I won't say a lot, because I think a lot of us are just. I see. I keep
A lot of
saying
people,
that,
I think,
but
have
don't
given
know.
up at this point, but unfortunately,
But that's right. That's not acceptance. That's just
yeah,
acquiescence.
it's like give
we
up.
just-
Yeah.
like that. Giving up is not a
Yeah.
commendable move. So it's but because they were doing it, they're going to do it anyway. No one seems to stop them, and it's no. We really have to take those measures to make it genuine consent.
Yeah.
That I think that's what's missing
Yeah.
here. Like to be really useful, it needs a lot of us as the individual in it, but it has to be genuine consent to having a lot of us in it,
Yeah.
as it were, or a lot of the individual's data to make useful and non-harmful recommendations and responses. Yeah. Anyway, that's
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Okay, so the next thing I want to ask you about is something you already touched upon just briefly, but it's about those cases where we're dealing with vague or blurry cases where even in case of human constitutions or laws, it's not exactly clear how to approach that problem. And so one thing is the human oversight, right? So these judges that would potentially look into that. And I think the same thing would apply or could apply in the case of the AI supervision enhanced with human supervision, right? That is one thing. But the one inherent problem, I think, to constitutional AI in particular is, and that's what sets it apart, I think, from human constitution, is the vagueness or lack of clarity on what particular terms mean. So this is something I struggle with. On the one hand, I'm amazed at how these models are actually getting better in terms of like their alignment behavior. They do become better aligned using constitutional AI, right? On the other hand, when you look at those principles, it's just a bunch of do's and don'ts. So this is bad, don't do it. This is good, do that. So this is like in this particular case of that, the paper they published, it's just a random set of 16 principles to illustrate the point, but it doesn't matter. Even if we decide these actually 16 principles are the core principles of human morality or whatever, still, it's just a bunch of added context or like, in a way, like prompts that are being used within the training process, as opposed to the human case of a constitution where, or even like any legal term. So when you open any account online, or I don't know, at Facebook or Instagram, whatever, there's always a terms of use. And when you go through it, like all those terms are defined usually clearly, right? And that for like legal purposes, that is important. What those terms mean, what are the audiences, what are the people and the organization and so on in that contract. In terms of constitutional AI, on the other hand, I don't see that clarity. It feels and it seems like the model is relying on its predetermined, like a statistical understanding of what those terms mean. So good or bad, racist or not. Like it's kind of like already, so the model is already trained on a bunch of data, right? And has some understanding of what these terms mean. And now it's being told to implement those concepts of good or bad and so on the responses that the model produces. So it's like there's a lack of clarity as to what those mean. And I don't see that implemented into these constitutions. And on the other hand, like I said, I am amazed that it's actually working. It's interesting.
Yeah, the amazing thing about this is that it works at all. Like it's like what this actually works. But in a way, right? This connected to the thing that we were talking about already, where you lay down some principles and there's some words that are ultimately going to be undefined, and the model is relying on the humans that are training it to make an interpretation of those words. And these are going to be the important ones. And even some of them are going to be as it were, just what are the truth conditions for certain sentences, right?
Yeah.
We make certain judgments about how to interpret those, and then those get used in the model. Inevitably, any system is going to rely ultimately on its interpreters, right? This is really largely a reflection of those interpreters. Any legal system, any system of rules whatsoever is going to, when it gets down to it, rely on its interpreters.
Yeah.
So it's like just an unavoidable fact of implementation.
Yeah.
I think. So even though and sometimes all of those things where it's like the legal terms and conditions, and then they specify, what does it mean to be a user? What does it mean to this, that, and the other thing? They try to give some explanation of those things. But then, of course, those explanations have to be interpreted as well. So there's this never-ending descent of interpretation. And where it bottoms out is in the person doing the interpreting. It's not that, and perhaps a particular interpreter's understanding, it would be very difficult to articulate what that even is. So it always just got, and what's fascinating is that now we have these AI models that are acting as interpreters of these things based on a kind of average of the interpretations of a bunch of others. So it's like you get a new bottom that is a new sort of resting point.
Yeah.
That is the average of a bunch of interpretations of something. Yeah. So in a way that provides this new paradigm of semantics for the languages that are being used. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, and that reminds me of, there's this article early on when ChatGPT came out. Stephen Wolfram, the guy who runs the Wolfram Alpha website and the apps and everything, he wrote, it's a very long but very accessible article. I encourage everyone to take a look at that, and I will put the link in the description. And he also talks about it in like everywhere he goes. He gestures at this hidden semantics of natural language that these statistically operating models such as ChatGPT probably capture, right? So syntactically, we do have theories of syntax in the language, right? Semantics for natural language is usually proposed in different ways. So it's different ways of defining semantics, but it's what we think human language is like, the semantics of it, and then we have different theories of it, right? Now, something like ChatGPT, according to Wolfram, and I think that's a great intuition to explore, is that there are actual universal patterns that these models seem to capture and what certain things mean. Like these patterns that a normal human being or a group of them wouldn't be able to capture because they can't compile billions of pages of data.
Yeah.
No matter how smart you are. But something he wouldn't mention, but I think is the case, is that doesn't mean that there will be a contradiction or contrast between those. Maybe there will be, but maybe in some cases I'm assuming a lot of cases they would converge as well. But eventually, again, how these models work seems to capture some nuanced semantical structure in natural languages, which were and are unbeknownst to us. And that itself might be, like, if someone explores that, say, if I wanted to do research on that and explore it, I would want to show or explore how that semantical pattern that, supposing that exists, how would that be a well-defined, or comprehensive semantical theory, like in a systematic way. And that would be a pretty good grounding for the constitutional AI in general, right? Because now we have this, let's say, robust theory of semantics, which we don't have at the moment. But again, if I were to explore that, or anyone else who explores that, and then they get at this, like some sort of vector semantics coming out of these models, that sounds like a pretty good grounding for like interpreting what the terms in the Constitution mean. So just to summarize, this was a very long along with the suggestion. So to summarize that, I think if these models are exploring or getting at some sort of universal semantics for natural languages, which they seem to be doing, as Wolfram suggests, then in that case, that's actually pretty interesting. And then that addresses the concern that we just had, where the lack of clarity, like who decides what these terms mean anyway, like what's good or bad or what's racist or not, and so on. The humanity decides in its entirety. there is
Yeah, a huge. Let's think about that. So if there were, how many people are there on the planet now?
is it 8 billion people last time I checked?
8 billion people, say 1 billion people are using this.
Yeah.
Are they, but even then, most of it is done in English. So it's like we have it, so it's of that language, but people are trying to do things in different languages. But nonetheless, getting that kind of that many people's take on English is useful data. It's almost a shame that it's proprietary, right? Because it's, the experimental, or shall we say, empirical linguists and the theoretical linguists and the mathematical linguists could probably use this kind of data to good effect, right? But yeah, but they're trying to think about this as a way of making concrete an average interpretation of these things, and being like, having a model of what that even meant is interesting, because we have to. One of the things I do, of course, is I teach logic, and one of those things that you try to teach in logic is you pretend there's this logical form that goes with, or rather I should say this formula, and so that's what we think of as a logical form that goes with this sentence, and in fact this kind of sentence. And class after class, there's always something where I present a sentence, a bunch of my students have a different interpretation of the sentence, and there are times where I'm like, that's not what that word means. But then there are times where it's, you know what, that is a viable interpretation of that sentence. This sentence was ambiguous, definitely, and I just have to culpa, right? Because you look at some words, you interpret them one way, and then that interpretation sticks, and then it's like a gestalt shift to shift out of that, right? And it just takes somebody else looking at it and already being shifted into that other sort of way of looking at it. And then, but you have to go, yeah, it's not that. But then if you have this other paradigm where you can talk about, this is what the average of all of these folks is, that gives you another way of approaching that kind of general interpretation problem of natural language.
Yeah, that's something I want to explore now. Maybe we can add to the list of the things that we're working on together. I would love to explore this idea of this universal semantics, maybe let's call it, of natural languages. And by the way, one issue that you mentioned, I think that is something to be addressed in principle, where the user base is like 1 billion and then mostly English language and so on. In principle, we could have a model given, like everyone has access to it in every language, and like that is just like a practical limitation on where these companies are located and so on. But in principle, still I can imagine that's not going to be a real limitation. It's just something that is, as a matter of fact, the way these models have been trained because of where they are located and the fact that English is the predominant language in the world and so on. So with all of that said, this brings us to the end of this conversation, Gillman. I really appreciate your insights. This took us a while to figure out the time, the topic, and everything, but I'm really glad I did this. As always, I really enjoy just chatting with you about anything, but when it comes to philosophy, which we both are philosophers, so that's always an extra layer of fun. The icing on the cake, that's the expression I've learned recently. That's the icing on the cake. I use it.
You're getting all of these English idioms.
Yeah, I'm using it everywhere these days. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your insights. And I hope to see you again. Maybe we can discuss the universal semantics or something else in the future.
Yes, totally. I'm looking forward to it.